All right, it's a couple of minutes after the hour. Let's get started. Welcome everyone to the July 2022 OpenZFS leadership meeting. I have to run after a couple of minutes, so Brian is going to be leading the meeting. I wanted to make a brief announcement about the conference before I step out. So we're going to have the conference. It's going to be in person and live streaming in San Francisco at the same location that we've had it before at the Children's Museum. It's going to be October 24th and 25th. I'll send out an email today with some more details, but the website is live. So if you go to the OpenZFS.org website, you'll see some info there. So right now, we have the request for proposals is open. So folks, we'd love to see a lot of great talks this year. I know people have been working hard on ZFS, so send me, email me with your proposals of what you'd like to talk about. Just like, a couple sentences or a paragraph. We'd love to hear about new features that you've been developing, or performance observations, or how you're integrating OpenZFS into your ecosystem. And we also have sponsorship opportunities. Obviously, in-person conferences are much more expensive than remote conferences. We've raised the ticket prices only slightly to $150, which does not come anywhere close to covering the cost of putting on the conference. So we rely on sponsorships. We've had a lot of great sponsors in the past, and we hope to get some solid sponsorship this year, financial sponsorship. So that is open as well. We are just putting the finishing touches on the sponsorship letter with all the info for sponsors. And we'll be contacting previous sponsors with that soon. But if you're interested in sponsoring, email us, or if you're interested in speaking, email me. And I hope to see you all there. You have until the end of August 29th, to submit your talks. And we will be having COVID protocols, including masking and hopefully testing and vaccination requirements, if we're able to set up contract with a third party to do verification of that info. Any questions or comments about the conference? All right. Well, I'm pretty excited to see all of you back in person. I mean, I haven't been to a in-person conference maybe since the 2019 OpenZFS one. So it's been quite a while for me. Hope to see everyone who feels comfortable traveling in October.
Yeah, looking forward to it.
Absolutely. It'll be nice to have it in person again. So if we're done with the conference, I guess I can pick up the rest of the agenda. See you, Matt. I see we've got a little bit of an agenda this month. Things got added. Looks like the first item on the list here is relaxed quota enforcement for performance. So I don't know who put this one on the agenda, but I assume I assume this is talking about our long-standing issue. When you get really close to being near the quota, performance kind of gets throttled back severely, right? As it starts forcing out transaction groups.
Yeah, especially if you're overwriting something that's there, you'll end up being like, okay, you're going to exceed the quota, so I'm gonna do a wait for transaction flush. And then the performance, like with a benchmark, you can even see the performance dropping to like single-digit megabytes per second once you start hitting that. It's a little bit less bad with the lower inflation setting for when ZFS assumes how badly it's going to lay things out on disk. That helps a little bit, but you still run into that quota and it gets pretty bad. This came out of that work we were doing on the write smoothing, and it turns out the problem is actually the same quota thing applies to zvols, especially when, and in a zvol case, you're always overwriting, right? You can't exceed the quota on a zvol because A, it doesn't have a quota, and B, it's the you can't write to LBAs that don't exist. And so you can actually see that same performance problem on zvols, where basically everything's an overwrite once it's relatively full. And that turns out that's what was actually causing the write stalls, where it would just be like a big chunk of time where you couldn't write anything more because the thread was stuck waiting for the transaction to flush to see if it should let you write more or not. And it always would because it's a zvol. So to address the version for file systems, we looked at basically adding a new property like quota strictness or something. We'll need to come up with a good name for it. And when set to lax, it would let you, do up to like one transaction group over the size to, instead of being strict to exactly the quotas, like you can go over a little bit, but, so that the performance won't suck as bad. And then either using that or just outright making zvols not respect the quota, since you won't be able to write larger than the vol size no matter what you do, right?
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like the thing to do there for zvols is, just not enforce the quota, because you kind of got one already implied, right? By the size of the volume.
Yeah, and since you can't actually set a quota proper, because in that case, it might actually make sense because a quota includes the snapshots and as well. But if you try to set a quota on a zvol, it tells you that doesn't apply to this type. But it turns out that the actual quota is still set internally and used in all these cases. So yeah, we're thinking of basically just, if the object type is zvol, we'll just say, yeah, it's okay. But also might as well fix it for file systems while we're in there. So we expect to have a patch like next week. Go ahead.
Considering that zvols can be thin provisioned and oversubscribed, whatever, quota may have sense there. So I'm not sure it should be dropped completely, but I agree that some relax could be there. Just speaking about your case, have you set quotas there explicitly or parent data set or somewhere?
So no, it looks like the value is just getting populated with the vol size, which would be the same thing, I think, in the case of the thin provision version, but we should test that and make sure we don't cause explosions. So yeah, we got most of a prototype together. We're just working on adding the test cases to, show that what the problem is and how we fix it. And that, like Mav says, I want to make sure we don't do the wrong thing in the case of a thin provision quota. Because yeah, I was very surprised to see on the DSL dir, the DD_quota being set to a value for a zvol, because you can't set a quota on a zvol, it won't let you. So I was wondering where it was coming from.
Yeah. I do think we need to be careful about the thin provisioning stuff too, because most applications don't take kindly to writing a block device and getting space back, right? That's not a thing they commonly handle well.
VMware at least does something semi-sane. It will just pause, suspend the VM and say, fix your disk or get some space or something. But yeah, a lot of applications will not know what to do if they get back space when writing to a block device.
No, VMware officially declares it. It's one of feature of VAI. I forgot what it is, but yeah, VMware should handle that. It should freeze VMs. It should do. It should have some warnings. And through NAS report, FreeBSD reports through iSCSI layer, like quota usage. You can see that from initiator side how close you're to quota. So it's supposed to all work.
Yes,
so
it all works for VMware, but I imagine a lot of other applications don't do the right thing.
No, yeah, I would just, we don't advertise it actively, but if we can have it working, it would be better to have it working.
Yep.
Yeah, that sounds great. So we can expect a pull request?
Yes.
Yes, cool. So do we have anything else on that topic, or should we move on? Sounds like we covered that pretty well.
If anybody has a suggestion on what to call the dataset property, because I don't know, quota underscore strictness seems a little meh.
Don't we have something like strict something already? Some properties like strict quota sounds better to me rather than quota strictness, but whatever.
Yeah.
I think strict quota, because I guess the other question I had was, right now we're looking at just an enum of like, strict and lax or whatever. But does it make sense to instead maybe have you specify how much they can go over or something?
Well, I'm wondering if we actually need a property at all, actually. Like, could we not always be a little bit lax here? I mean, the consequences seem pretty minimal if you're just allowing to go over like a transaction group, right? For the file.
Well, I guess depending on your dirty data max and a couple other things, that could be.
Yeah.
Well,
can we be intelligent? Can we be intelligent about it if we say like the quota size is larger than X times the dirty data max, then we are always lax, and otherwise like we scale it back proportionally. Can we do something like that, or does that not make sense? Do we always have to be at least one TXG over for it to work?
I suppose maybe it does make sense to do something like, when it's set to lax, you're allowed to go like, I don't know, but some factor of the original of the quota size, like 10%, or I think 12.5% is a nice bit shift number of how much you would be able to go over the quota so that it's a little more well-defined.
And then the idea would be if we have something that auto-tunes based on dirty data max, then we don't need an additional setting, which
well, in this case, I would auto-tune just based on what the quota is, so that, if you set a quota to a gig, they can't go more than like 100 megabytes over. But if you set it to a terabyte, they can go some gigs over. And in the end, as long as it's never more than, I don't know, 6% or whatever number we decide, then maybe that makes sense.
Yeah, probably minimum of 2 or something.
Yeah. Because and then we could maybe not need a property for it that way.
I mean, that seems preferable to me. We've already got a ton of properties, right?
Yeah, I have
one more to have to set for this like fine tuning seems like maybe unnecessary. We can find some heuristic that's reasonable. Unless people are really concerned about being very strict about, the quota enforcement and not going over at all, but
I don't think very many people are.
Yeah. They just don't want it to slow down, right? When they get
that's really the big thing is, especially since it can affect things pretty badly. If you're waiting for the transaction group, you can end up making other writes to the pool that aren't affected by the quota slow, and then it's like, So we'll look at that and get something together.
Sounds good. So let's see, what else we got on our list? Looks like we got one about the Z here. How best to store configuration for the Z?
Yes, so somebody wants to change like how many errors in how many seconds before it kicks the device out of the pool. Right now, in Illumos, those come from some system properties or whatever, but on Linux, they're just hard coded as like 10 errors in 15 minutes or something. And we'd like to be able to change that, but what would that look like?
Yeah, so this is actually a bit of outstanding work that's been outstanding since the Z got implemented on Linux originally. We always had an item to come back and make this tunable and configurable, and then we never did. It just never bubbled up to the top of the list. But I think that's a great idea. The original thinking was to provide some kind of, flat config file in Etsy or whatever that could tune various Z parameters. But that was just an initial notion. So if people have better ideas or about how to go about that, right, we could store some information as pool properties, although I just, said not to add more pool properties.
Well, this would be a pool property, not a data set property, but
there you go.
Because I've asked in my other presentation when I did the VDEV property stuff, it's like, how many properties is too many properties, and how do we decide? Because at some point it's like, I just want more, but maybe some of them shouldn't show up by default, but then having hidden ones also seems weird and gets crazy. And I guess is how many things are there to tune with Z? If there's only like 3 or 4 things, do we just do like command line parameters then? Or
yeah, that's an option too. My recollection is there were only maybe 3 or 4 things, something like that were obvious to tune. And what the right values for them wasn't obvious either, right? Which is how we ended up with the current defaults. They're like, well, this seems reasonable for most cases. But certainly something you could dial in. I mean, I think a flat config file would be fine or something along those lines. I'd say that fell apart because we didn't want all the work involved in pulling in a parser, right? To do that kind of work again. It's like, that seems unnecessary for 3 or 4 values, right?
Yeah, because the Illumos one was you just got past an NV list from some other part of the system and you didn't have to do all the heavy lifting. But if you need a config parser, then it gets more complicated.
Can you elaborate a little on what those configurables are? Like what tunables?
The main 2 are how many errors in how many seconds before you kick a device out of the pool for being faulty.
Yeah, so it's configuration variables for the default Z script that we ship, right?
Well, right now the values are hard coded in the Z, but it's something along the line of if I get 10 checksum errors in a 10-minute window, right? I'm going to degrade the drive, or I think that's the at the moment.
The Z script, at least on Linux, they are in etc anyway right now. So in theory, like if some, or am I mistaken in that?
The values are hard coded in like the C files.
Oh, okay, in the C file section. Okay, sorry.
Yeah. So the goal is to put them somewhere, where they're easier to tune. I think that would be fine if we just want to make command line options. That seems like the easiest thing to do if we're only talking about 2 or 3. Does anybody know offhand where they're set on Illumos or where they come from on Illumos? Yeah.
Sorry, I had to hit the mute button. I would need to look. They're probably coming from the FMA system because that's really what handles that. There's a whole separate infrastructure on Illumos that's system-wide for handling faults. And so then there's a module for ZFS that basically, when ZFS generates the error, it consumes that, and there's a configuration there, then decides. So that's what actually like kicks in spares and all of that. Excuse me.
Yeah, that's probably more infrastructure than we want to bring in, which is why it was hard coded before.
Yeah, I just wanted to see if anybody had an opinion on that before we go and implement it.
I mean, mod or command line options sound fine to me, right? Because they'd be easy to encode in whatever starting the daemon, right? Be it
and then
the deconfig file or whatever, and they'd be easy to document.
Yep, and don't involve a bunch of infrastructure, like pulling in like libucl or something to do config parsing.
Yeah.
If we needed that for a bunch of different things, it would make sense to pick something and have a common config format, but we're talking about like 2 to 4 variables here probably, so.
Yeah, I agree. That seems like the easiest way to go is just make them command line options. And if in the future we have an explosion of options, we can always come back and do something better. But that doesn't seem likely.
Well, then if you wanted to use it in production with a different value, you'd have to edit the services file or the ZFSZ service or run it manually, right?
Yeah, you can use, like, we can still have the service file sourced in an environment file and then have defaults for that. I think that is the practice for daemons that do not support config files.
Oh, okay.
I was going to say, I do actually have a thought and a question though. Is there a reason that the handling of kicking drives out is in the C file and not just one where Z script?
Because the Z doesn't source any of the Z scripts when it runs, right? It's just a binary. It gets launched as a long running daemon. So it never looks at any of those values other than values that are, supplied to it as command line options.
Yeah, I understand that. I'm just wondering, is there something about handling kicking the drives out that you can't implement as a zlet?
I think it's mostly keeping track of how many times the event has happened within the time window and so
Right,
on.
because they're stateless. Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, there's a whole fault management infrastructure that we got from Solaris that's kind of partially built into the Z, where it does things like opens a case for any kind of failures from the disk and associates events with it, and eventually resolves it by doing something like faulting the disk or whatever. So there's actually quite a lot of state that gets managed internally. I guess
I have a question here. Is it a huge complication to make this as pool properties? Because the pools are always going to be associated with the family of devices. And as I'm pondering this, I'm wondering if there are a family or a tier, several tiers of devices, each making up a different pool. How would I apply a different set of settings to each pool, depending on this attribute that we want to have some control over?
Yeah, I can see doing it as a Z-pool property would solve that nicer, because doing that with a config file or command line gets much gnarlier.
Well, there's a line of, it's a level of coupling that has to be enforced manually.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if we really would want different values in these cases, though. Like I say, we're only talking about, like, in this case, how many errors before a drive gets kicked out. It doesn't seem like those values be too wildly different between pools, but yeah, I guess they could be. And then
Alan, I hope I'm not stepping on any territory here, but I'm the individual who reached out to Alan with these questions. I work for Seagate, and we've noticed a couple of things with some Broadcom IOCs, where they're MP3 SAS drivers generating info level messages. There isn't a genuine error, but we've got no way to, it's completely random quantum mechanics or something like that. It's deeply embedded in Broadcom's IOC. No other file system that we've ever worked with has ever had an issue with, and by the way, this is specifically looking at our some of our RAID Lite products, in particular Core Vault, which I've had huge success for in the Web3 space and dstore space. We're doing 10 plus petabyte direct attached file systems, but there's this annoying thing that comes around about once every couple of days when we get several instances of these info messages coming up, and the Z daemon doesn't know the difference between these this being a write error or an information message coming up from the MPT3 SAS driver. It's a log info message, and basically what it says is we have a write operation in progress, a CDB write 16, and occasionally the target says detects something that is like a checksum or something and asks for a retry. The driver does it, it always succeeds. Not a retry isn't a write retry, but a retransmission. However, that info message that event occurred is percolated back up the stack. And so it doesn't happen on the 9400 class IOCs that it's 32, I forget what the exact part numbers, but it's limited to a handful of Broadcom IOC chipsets. And we can't fix it from the Seagate side. And Broadcom has been scratching their head over it for 5 months. And again, it's not indicative of an error per se. It is a simple thing that happens. You know, any given link is not going to be error-free into perpetuity. There are going to be occasions where a bit flips and a transmission is required. And that's exactly what we're looking at.
So I've got a question.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I've got a couple of questions about that. So my recollection is nothing should percolate up through the Z unless, at least on Linux, we actually get an error from the low-level block device. So either we got an error back returned from the block layer, right, as an EIO or something like that, or we legitimately got the wrong data back from a device. right? And then we generate a checksum error saying like,
Yeah.
right?
So there's no data that comes back. This is an event that takes place completely at the driver layer because it's the host is doing a write. The target, in this case, the Seagate SAS target, says something wasn't right about that. I'm missing something, or a checksum didn't match. Please resend. The driver does it. When it completes, the driver, the MP3 SAS driver notifies with this log info message. I can give you the exact. I can share the screen and give you a live demonstration of it right now. I've been testing it all day again.
Yeah.
But it's also interesting that Broadcom has a number of tools that the store CLI. And if anybody wants to duplicate this in a benign context, if you simply use the store CLI to retrieve error counters on a running Broadcom HBA, it will generate these error messages. If you request the error counters 10 times in less than 5 minutes, you will fault the device if it's in a Z-RAID type config. And no device error has occurred.
Yeah, I'd be interested to dig into that a little bit more because like you say, I don't think that should percolate up beyond the driver itself, right? I don't think the higher levels of ZFS should, as I remember the code right now, should even be notified of it. Nothing should notice that. So I'd be curious to know where the Z is picking up those errors from.
Well, and it's interesting because XFS, ext4, ButterFS, none of them pay attention to this info message that's percolating up, and I can reproduce the same thing using nothing but DD, and the events still take place, and never a byte of data is lost or requires a retry from DD itself or anything like that. So in the simplest use case possible, we're streaming writes out there, and it, depending on the position of the planet or something like that, something causes the target to not see the write 16 and request the driver to retransmit. It does. Everybody moves on. Everybody's happy. But for some reason, the Z daemon is seeing this.
Yeah, that sounds like a problem in Z.
Yeah, it does. I just don't understand how it's getting notified of it at all.
I know.
Yeah, exactly.
It says something on there.
Completely ignorant.
Yeah.
But again, this is it's an issue that is limited to a very small subset of Broadcom chipsets. Unfortunately, Seagate uses a lot of them, and we're looking. So I'm going back and I'm asking how to best make this a tunable, because it would probably be on a per device pool basis.
Do these manifest as IO errors or checksum errors?
Nope, none of the above.
I think it's a write error.
Nope, there's no write error.
Like in zpool status, it increments the write error counter.
It does not.
So
they never change. Ever.
So what's the bad behavior? So I'm coming a little bit late on this discussion. I must be in the meeting here.
The bad behavior is if more than 3 events happen in something like a 5-minute window. Again, these relatively benign events. If we see more than 3 of them in a finite period of time, the device will be evicted from the pool, provided if we are running in a RAID Z or a D-RAID configuration where there's enough devices. The device will be evicted from the pool. Issuing a zpool clear brings it back. Everybody's happy. If we are running in with a single device so we just created a ZFS file system on a single SCSI target. These events happen and nothing ever comes of it. The single ZFS file system keeps running forever. And like I said, this is important to me because I have found ZFS to be ZFS plus our Core Vault technology. I can create a stack of 800 terabyte LUNs, and I'm giving the Web3 community, whether we're talking Chia or Filecoin or anything on the StorageA, the IPFS world, for the first time ever, they're getting direct attached ZFS file systems in the 10+ petabyte range. And it works.
Yeah, so it sounds like Zed does have as Ryan said earlier, Zed has logic to do the device swap, device fail processing, but I'm with you, Brian. I don't know where this information is coming. We need to probably do just some debugging with Zed to find out how these events are being handled by Zed, and because it sounds like maybe this is just a bug.
Well, I've stared into the abyss, and I can't make sense because there's notification between different aspects of Zed, and so there's not a clear line of sight communication where counter event is noticed and a counter increments.
Zed is a little bit opaque from that perspective.
Well, I knew I was outside of my league, and I ran to Alan, but we want to do the right thing for ZFS. I don't want to do a cheat in any kind of way. However, this is I spent some time at SpectraLogic working on ZFS several years back. So I want to do the right thing by the community, and I understand that the importance of not fudging this to make one shady product work. I don't think we've got a shady product, and I certainly know that Broadcom cannot figure out why they're sending a NAC sometimes on some of these writes, and they've been instrumenting the hell out of it.
So I think one easy thing to check initially might be to run the zpool events command. So basically there's two streams of data that the Zed's picking up on. There's what it gets from the kernel modules, which you can see all those events in the zpool events command. If you run it, it'll show everything the kernel modules detected and the Zed picked up on. But it's also got a stream of events coming from UDEV for the block devices. So that would be probably a spot to start to see like why it's which one of those forces is causing the Zed to even be aware of the issue. That would at least give us a spot to help narrow it down. Yeah, it does sound like a bug.
Yeah,
and like I said, I'm turning to Alan on this stuff. I want to do what's right by the community, but so far it's taken us a lot of time to start setting up. Seagate's a big company and whatnot, and just getting the door open so we can start peering into the void. I am not qualified to make these decisions. I looked at it a little bit and I got all tangled up in knots trying to figure out. It goes into and it goes out as the Zed daemon traffic.
Right.
So I just know that I totally respect doing the right thing by the ZFS community, and I'm hoping that this gives people a tunable that's applicable in some other use cases.
You said you had a relatively easy to run reproducer of some
Oh,
kind?
yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And I hope within a day or two, I've got a Go teleport infrastructure set up, so I'll be able to get Alan inside of my private labs and give him access to 6 core vault systems and 12 controllers, and I'll show him all my tests.
Yeah, if you can reproduce, you should be able to nail it down as to what's going on there.
And I've got a fresh install of Ubuntu 22.04 for you, Alan, and ZFS built from tips as of 2 days ago, running on it right now.
Perfect.
Great. Yeah, then it sounds like next steps there are to, dig into it a little bit and see where the error is coming from.
Yep.
And go from there.
That's
Thank you, gentlemen.
All right. Let's see. Looks like we got.
We could let Mav go next instead of just all me all the time.
Yeah, sounds good. Go for it.
Maybe I already asked a couple times, but what are our plans for 2.2? Or do we have any schedule to plan ahead? Because we're doing release engineering for TrueNAS, we wanted just to know what to expect. And very narrow case, like what shall I do now for scrap performance optimizations? Do they count as fixes for 2.1, or they will stay in here forever and I'll have to cherry pick them in our internal branch?
Yeah. So I'd say we don't have any concrete plans yet for 2.2. I mean, historically, we've kicked out about an average, a major release like that every year, basically, was our previous cadence, but it doesn't have to stay that way. I've seen quite a bit of interest in people maintain the need for like a longer term maintained stable branch, like the 2.1 was going to be, or is intended to be at the moment, right? Where we just cherry pick more stuff into it, just have a stable base that people can run for a long time. I don't know that stops us from tagging a new 2.2 release though. If people think that it's enough interesting stuff is in there to warrant us making a new release and maintaining it. As for the scrub changes in particular, I would say those are probably pretty safe to backport to 2.1, and that would make a lot of sense.
No, yeah, I'll cherry pick that create pairs. That's easy, but still would be good to have some kind of timeline. Okay, here's past timeline, here's future. We plan next branch in about next new year or something like that. So that on the FreeBSD we have more or less time its releases. So if you look back into history, they are so periodically you can just prognose when the next one should happen, even so it's not published. So it would be good to have at least some ideas. If it's feature based, that's one thing that's useful. If it's time based, then at least some forecast. Because we're already planning things to at least to the end of the year with Truna scale that we have already 2 branches in development right now. They are both going from 2.1, but the one could already potentially benefit from jumping user since it's in Nightless. But
I mean, if we stuck with our previous cadence, it would be about November or something like that. We would probably cut a 2.2. We should probably talk if that's a reasonable plan or if that makes sense to people. If there's enough stuff there, you know, if that'll be worth cutting a branch and maintaining it. My feeling is there's actually quite a lot of good stuff in the master branch that hasn't been backported yet. And probably won't be backported for 2.1, right? But there's a lot of interesting features in there. I don't have a list handy, but that would.
It's the Linux namespace stuff, VDEV properties, and how that applies to Mark's device evacuation queuing stuff.
Right.
Mav's done not just the scrub stuff, but just a huge number of great performance improvements. And I guess the other conversation is at what point do we call it 3.0 instead of 2.2 or whatever?
I was assuming RAID Z expansion.
I think at some point we said like when we integrate macOS support into the main repo, then it would be 3.0.
Okay.
And of course.
What the number is doesn't matter to me so much, but I think that, if we had a rough plan to do 2.2 in November, that sounds reasonable to me. I guess what the timeline would be good for you, Alexander. Like I know we also want to think about in the future figuring out what that timeline is going to look like for all the different things that consume it, whether that's the next Ubuntu LTS or FreeBSD and TrueNAS and so on.
Well, it's impossible to predict everything. Like we are for TrueNAS scale, which is now in Nightless, we plan better. I think in August or just pretty soon. So November maybe already. Not so far. Pretty late again in release cycle, but still probably acceptable. I don't remember when release is planned, but somewhere in Q4. So I think November would be not bad.
I mean, it would also be worth taking a look at what outstanding features we have that are pretty close to completion, right? If any of those are worthy of getting some effort on to get them wrapped up and merged, right? I know there's some outstanding container work too. There's quite a lot of open PRs with significant features in them, right? The RAID Z expansion work, right, would be great to wrap up. There's a whole bunch of things that fall in this category. I know it's a never-ending list, but I guess we'd have to take a real look at what's outstanding still and figure out what we could reasonably include in that time frame and who might be able to work on it if we want to get it in. Yeah. So I guess what would next steps be there? I guess I could go through and make a list of like major outstanding features and then kind of assess what's currently in the master branch, right? That would at least give us a better idea of what's already ready and you know what might need a little more work.
Yeah, I guess thinking back a couple of months, how close is the direct IO stuff?
It's out ready for review right now, so that's
And-
ready to go. So
And Pavel's
Actually-
BRT stuff, I think, is almost to that point as well, right?
yeah, I believe so. It would be great to be able to get both those things in.
Mhm.
And speaking of the direct IO stuff, I know it would really benefit from a review on the FreeBSD side too. I think it's been heavily tested on Linux, but there might be one or two open issues still with FreeBSD. We're not quite sure it's behaving right. So people have a chance to look at it, that would be great. But I know we're looking for reviews for that.
I'm talking to one of the FreeBSD VM experts tomorrow. I'll ask him to take a look.
Yeah, that would be great. Because I think that is ready to go too. I think we've got a couple other features too that are really close, ready to merge. We could wrap up, and that might give us a really nice 2.2 release with a bunch, with enough but not too many features, right? We got to be careful about piling too many in. So
Yeah, we don't want too many last minute things, but
yeah. All right. Well, I guess we've got next steps there and something to talk about a little bit more. Do we have anything else on the agenda?
I think Alex was adding a review request for the corruption healing receive thing.
Yep.
And then I had
Another
one
that's
for
really
the
close.
yeah. Then I had my review request for the SPA inflation thing where instead of just statically using 24 times your A size, it actually looks at the VDEV type and figures out what is actually the inflation is going to be, so that you don't look like you're going to go over the quota by 24 megabytes when you write 1 megabyte. But
So
actually,
you have that all figured out now, Alan?
I think it's all figured out now, yes.
All right.
All right. So I can take a look at some of those things. Looks like also on the agenda here is directory scaling.
Yeah,
So that is something I've looked at in the past, with things, and my experience has been it actually scales quite well once you get to FATZAPs. At least the insertion and removal time is constant, right? We've scaled up to billions of entries in a directory, right? And it does scale at least that far, is our experience. But maybe you were driving at something a little different here.
Mostly just we noticed with the benchmark that, doing open with ocreate or whatever on files after, as we did it more and more, the time it took increased. Like with only a couple thousand files in the directory, it would take 500 microseconds. But when there's like 50 million files in the directory, it would take like 2.3 milliseconds. And this was backed by really fast NVMe devices.
Yeah, so I guess I should have been more clear, right? So maybe what you're seeing is the conversion from a tiny zap or one of the micro zap actually to a fat zap, right? So,
well, I think we're past that if we have 50 million files, right?
Yeah, but like if you saw that transition at 1,000
Right.
or so, right? It's maybe in that ballpark, right? And maybe things have changed, but my recollection has been that we saw pretty good scaling. Once it did that conversion, you started making fat zaps. It scaled pretty well. But if you've got data that shows differently, it's something we should probably look at.
We're just about to start trying to collect data, and we're just curious if anybody had previous experience or any thing they knew to look out for.
I think the other thing,
the other thing is if you delete files from a directory, the zap doesn't shrink. So even with an empty directory that used to have a lot of entries, you could run into some performance problems that way.
Yeah, that's a known issue.
Wasn't there a PR for that?
There's an Illumos one for being able to shrink the zap, and it's been on my radar for a while to look at, even just for the dedupe stuff, because you have the same problem when you drain your dedupe thing, and you end up with the big DDT, even though you don't have any entries in it. And in particular, that was throwing off all the math for trying to figure out to try and do the DDT quota stuff, because you would find that your average entry size would be huge because you'd have all these empty zap slack. And yeah, but that's not the case we're looking at here, but that is one I'm aware of as well.
Yeah.
So yeah, hopefully next month we'll have some numbers to share, maybe some graphs or something, and we'll
That'd
see.
be good.
Is that on FreeBSD or Linux?
Linux.
Okay, maybe try to, if you collect some data using standardized tooling, then try to collect the directory cache stats as well.
Yes,
and
that was
also the
another thing we were
tunables. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't have that many of these giant NVMe machines to be able to try FreeBSD and see if there's a difference.
Yeah.
But more on that soon, I guess.
Yeah. So that looks like everything that was on the current agenda. Does anybody else have anything they want to add? Looks like we got about 10 minutes left, or any other topics we should cover? Sounds like a no to me. So maybe we can wrap this up a little bit early. Hearing no one else, I guess that was good. We'll call it a wrap. Thanks everybody for showing up this week and talking through this stuff.
All right.
Right.
Thanks.
Yep.